How is it that the Korean War escaped the protests which surrounded the war in Vietnam? Everything we've come to love and cherish about Vietnam had its forerunner in Korea. The support of a corrupt tyranny, the atrocities, the napalm, the mass slaughter of civilians, the cities and villages laid to waste, the calculated management of the news, the sabotaging of peace talks. But the American people were convinced that the war in Korea was an unambiguous case of one country invading another without provocation. A case of the bad guys attacking the good guys who were being saved by the even better guys. None of the historical, political, and moral uncertainty that was the dilemma of Vietnam. The Korean War was seen to have begun in a specific manner. North Korea attacked South Korea in the early morning of June 25, 1950, while Vietnam, no one seemed to know how it all began, or when, or why. And there was little in the way of accusations about American imperialism in Korea. The United States, after all, was fighting as part of a United Nations army. What was there to protest about? And of course there was McCarthyism, so prevalent in the early 1950s, which further served to inhibit protest. There were, in fact, other different interpretations to be made of what the war was all about, how it was being conducted, even how it began, but these quickly succumbed to the heat of war fever. Shortly after the close of the Second World War, the Soviet Union and the United States occupied Korea in order to expel the defeated Japanese. A demarcation line between the Russian and American forces was set up along the 38th parallel. The creation of this line in no way had the explicit or implicit intention of establishing two separate countries, but the Cold War was soon to intrude. Japan colonized Korea in 1910. For the next 35 years, Korea became a source of immense profits for Japanese industrialists and financiers, extracted in the blood and suffering of Koreans. Numberless Koreans were forcibly shipped to Japan as forced laborers or as sexual slaves known as comfort women. But Japan could not plunder the peninsula alone. It had the help of wealthy Korean landowners and industrialists who, just as they had found favor with their Japanese masters, would find favor with the U.S. occupation government and later fill key positions in the South Korean state. While Pearl Harbor marked the formal beginning of armed hostilities between Japan and the United States, the two countries were locked in conflict well before Pearl Harbor. Both sought to dominate the countries of the Pacific Rim to secure their riches on a monopoly basis. Tokyo followed an aggressive and expansionary foreign policy backed by the gun to drive other imperialist powers from the region. The U.S., already with a dominant position in the Philippines, Guam, Hawaii, and Samoa, sought an open door for its exporters and investors in China. With both sides seeking a dominant role, it was inevitable they would sooner or later come to blows. It wasn't Koreans who bisected the Korean peninsula at the 38th parallel. It was the Americans. On August 10, 1945, with the Soviets having crossed into the Korean peninsula from the north 2 days earlier, two U.S. colonels, Dean Rusk and Charles Bonestell, were ordered to divide Korea into two occupation zones, one American and one Soviet. They chose the 38th parallel as the dividing line. It would give the U.S. control of the capital, Seoul. The Soviets accepted the division, demanding a Soviet occupation zone in the north of Japan upon Tokyo's surrender. The U.S. refused. A government organized by Koreans for Koreans, headquartered at Seoul, was founded within weeks of Japan's surrender. It called itself the Korean People's Republic, or KPR, born of the Committee for the Preparation of Korean Independence and the People's Committees rooted in the countryside. Despite its pretensions to be a champion of democracy, the United States refused to recognize the government and actively worked to repress it. For the Americans, the Korean People's Republic had two strikes against it. A. It wasn't answerable to Washington. B. It had strong communist influences. The two sides had been clashing across the parallel for several years. What happened on that fateful day in June could thus be regarded as no more than the escalation of an ongoing civil war. The North Korean government has claimed that in 1949 alone, the South Korean army or police perpetrated 2,617 armed incursions into the north to carry out murder, kidnapping, pillage, and arson for the purpose of causing social disorder and unrest, as well as to increase the combat capabilities of the invaders. At times, stated the Pyongyang government, thousands of soldiers were involved in a single battle with many casualties resulting. A State Department official, Ambassador-at-Large Philip C. Jessup, speaking in April 1950, put it this way: "There's constant fighting between the South Korean army and bands that infiltrate the country from the north. There are very real battles, involving perhaps 1,000 or 2,000 men. When you go to this boundary, as I did, you see troop movements, fortifications, and prisoners of war." Seen in this context, the question of who fired the first shot on June 25, 1950 takes on a much reduced air of significance. As it is, the North Korean version of events is that their invasion was provoked by 2 days of bombardment by the South Koreans on the 23rd and 24th, followed by a surprise South Korean attack across the border on the 25th against the western town of Haeju and other places. Announcement of the southern attack was broadcast over the Norse radio later in the morning of the 25th. Contrary to general belief at the time, no United Nations group, neither the UN Military Observer Group in the field nor the UN Commission on Korea and Seoul, witnessed or claimed to have witnessed the outbreak of hostilities. The observer group's field trip along the parallel ended on June 23rd. Its statements about what took place afterward are either speculation or based on information received from the South Korean government or the U.S. military. Moreover, early in the morning of the 26th, the South Korean Office of Public Information announced that Southern forces had indeed captured the North Korean town of Haeju. The announcement stated that the attack had occurred that same morning, but an American military status report as of nightfall on the 25th notes that all southern territory west of the Imjin River had been lost to a depth of at least 3 miles inside the border except in the area of the Haeju, quote-unquote, counterattack. In either case, such a military victory on the part of the southern forces is extremely difficult to reconcile with the official Western account, maintained to this day, that has the North Korean army sweeping south in a devastating surprise attack, taking control of everything that lay before it and forcing South Korean troops to evacuate further south. Subsequently, the South Korean government denied that its capture of Haeju had actually taken place, blaming the original announcement, apparently, on an exaggerating military officer. One historian has ascribed the allegedly incorrect announcement to, quote, an error due to poor communications plus an attempt to stiffen South Korean resistance by claiming a victory, unquote. Whatever actually lay behind the announcement, it is evident that very little reliance, if any, can be placed upon statements made by the South Korean government concerning the start of the war. There were, in fact, reports in the Western press of the attack on Haeju, which made no mention of the South Korean government's announcement, and which appear to be independent confirmations of the event. The London Daily Herald, in its issue of June 26, stated that, quote, American military observers said the Southern forces had made a successful relieving counterattack near the west coast, penetrated 5 miles into Northern Territory, and seized the town of Haeju, unquote. This was echoed in the Guardian of London the same day. American officials confirmed that the Southern troops had captured Haeju. Similarly, the New York Herald Tribune reported, also on the 26th, that, quote, South Korean troops drove across the 38th parallel, which forms the frontier, to capture the manufacturing town of Haeju, just north of the line. The Republican troops captured quantities of equipment, unquote. None of the accounts specify just when the attack took place. On the 25th, American writer John Gunther was in Japan preparing his biography of General Douglas MacArthur. As he recounts in the book, he was playing tourist in the town of Nikko with 2 important members of the American occupation. When, quote, one of these was called unexpectedly to the telephone. He came back and whispered, a big story is just broken. The South Koreans have attacked North Korea, unquote. That evening, Gunther and his party returned to Tokyo, where, quote, several officers met us at the station to tell us correctly and with much amplification what had happened. There is no doubt whatsoever that North Korea was the aggressor, unquote. And the telephone call? Gunther explains. The message may have been garbled in transmission. Nobody knew anything much at headquarters the first few hours, and probably people were taken in by the blatant, corrosive lies of the North Korean radio. There's something a little incongruous about the picture of American military and diplomatic personnel, practicing anti-communists each one, being taken in on so important a matter by communist lies, blatant ones no less. Owing to the Korean right-wing's unpopularity, it was impossible to put forward its representatives for election, so the U.S. looked to non-communist exiles, whose absence from the country had allowed them to escape the taint of collaboration. The fiercely anti-communist Syngman Rhee was eventually brought to power. Rhee had lived in the U.S. 40 years, earned a Ph.D. from Princeton, and married an American wife, a background very different from that of Kim Il-sung, North Korea's founder, who was active from the early 30s as a prominent leader of the resistance to Japanese occupations. Cummings notes that, quote, for nearly 4 decades, South Korea was run by military officers and bureaucrats who served the same Japanese masters that Kim and his friends spent a decade fighting in the 1930s. In 1948, the draconian national security law was used to round up 200,000 Koreans sympathetic to the North and communism. By 1949, 30,000 communists were in jail, and 70,000 were in concentration camps, euphemistically dubbed guidance camps. The South, and its repression of leftists, was beginning to resemble Italy of the 20s and Germany of the 30s, the resemblance which soon grew stronger. Kim scorned Korea's inability to resist foreign domination. The Japanese regarded him as a highly able and dangerous guerrilla leader, going so far as to establish a special anti-Kim insurgency unit to hunt him down. The guerrillas were an independent force, inspired by a desire to reclaim the Korean peninsula for Koreans, and were controlled by neither the Soviets nor Chinese. While they often retreated across the border into the Soviet Union to evade Japanese counterinsurgency forces, they received little material help from the Soviets. Unlike the U.S., which imposed a military government and repressed the people's committees, the Soviets took a fairly hands-off approach to their occupation zone, allowing a coalition of nationalist and communist resistance fighters to run their own show. Within 7 months, the first central government was formed based on an interim People's Committee led by Kim Il-sung. Contrary to popular mythology, Kim was not handpicked by the Soviets. He enjoyed considerable prestige and support as a result of his years as a guerrilla leader and his commitment to national liberation. In fact, the Soviets never completely trusted him. Both sides wanted war, but for different reasons. For the North, war was simply the next step in the struggle for independence and liberation from foreign domination. War had begun in 1945 when the U.S. landed at Incheon and began to repress the newly formed Korean People's Republic. Or, to put it another way, the war had started in 1910 with colonization by the Japanese. 1945 simply marked a change in the occupation regime. For the South, the reason for war was to drive to the North, to roll back the encroachments Kim's Workers' Party had made on the traditional elite, and to bring the whole of the peninsula under U.S. sovereignty. The project that had stretched back to the pre-war years when the U.S. and Japan had locked horns over the question of who would dominate the Pacific. The head of South Korea, Syngman Rhee, had often expressed his desire and readiness to compel the unification of Korea by force. On June 26, the New York Times reminded its readers that, quote, on a number of occasions, Dr. Rhee has indicated that his army would have taken the offensive if Washington had given consent, unquote. The Times noted also that before the war began, quote, the warlike talk, strangely, had almost all come from South Korean leaders, unquote. Rhee may have had good reason for provoking a full-scale war apart from the issue of unification. On May 30th, elections for the National Assembly were held in the South, in which Rhee's party suffered a heavy setback and lost control of the assembly. Like countless statesmen before and after him, Rhee may have decided to play the war card to rally support for his shaky rule. A labor advisor attached to the American aid mission in South Korea, Stanley Earle, resigned in July, expressing the opinion that the South Korean government was, quote, an oppressive regime which did very little to help the people, and that an internal South Korean rebellion against the Rhee government would have occurred if the forces of North Korea had not invaded, unquote. Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev, in his reminiscences, makes it plain that the North Koreans had contemplated an invasion of the South for some time, and he reports their actual invasion without any mention of provocation on that day. This would seem to put that particular question to rest. However, Khrushchev's chapter on Korea is a wholly superficial account. It is not a serious work of history, nor was it intended to be. As he himself states, quote, my memories of the Korean War are unavoidably sketchy, unquote. He did not become Soviet leader until after the war was over. His chapter contains no discussion of any of the previous fighting across the border, nothing of Rhee's belligerent statements, nothing at all even of the Soviet Union's crucial absence from the UN which, as we shall see, allowed the so-called United Nations Army to be formed and intervene in the conflict. Moreover, his reminiscences, as published, are an edited and condensed version of the tapes he made. A study based on a comparison between the Russian language transcription of the tapes and the published English language book reveals that some of Khrushchev's memories about Korea were indeed sketchy, but that the book fails to bring this out. For example, North Korean leader Kim Il-sung met with Stalin to discuss Kim's desire to, quote, prod South Korea with the point of a bayonet, unquote. The book then states unambiguously, Kim went home and then returned to Moscow when he had worked everything out. In the transcript, however, Khrushchev says, in my opinion, either the date of his return was set or he was to inform us as soon as he finished preparing all of his ideas. Then, I don't remember in which month or year, Kim Il-sung came and related his plan to Stalin. On June 26, the United States presented a resolution before the UN Security Council condemning North Korea for its quote-unquote unprovoked aggression. The resolution was approved, although there were arguments that this was a fight between Koreans and should be treated as a civil war, and a suggestion from the Egyptian delegate that the word unprovoked should be dropped in view of the long-standing hostilities between the two Koreas. Yugoslavia insisted as well that, quote, there seemed to be lack of precise information that could enable the council to pin responsibility, unquote, and proposed that North Korea be invited to present its side of the story. This was not done. 3 months later, the Soviet foreign minister put forward a motion that the UN hear representatives from both sides. This, too, was voted down by a margin of 46-6 because of North Korea's quote-unquote aggression, and it was decided to extend an invitation to South Korea alone. On the 27th, the Security Council recommended that members of the United Nations furnish assistance to South Korea, quote, as may be necessary to repel the armed attack, unquote. President Truman had already ordered the U.S. Navy and Air Force into combat by this time, thus presenting the Council with a fait accompli, a tactic the U.S. was to repeat several times before the war came to an end. The Council made its historic decision with the barest of information available to it, and all of it derived from and selected by only one side of the conflict. This was, as journalist I.F. Stone put it, neither honorable nor wise. It should be kept in mind that in 1950 the United Nations was in no way a neutral or balanced organization. The great majority of members were nations very dependent upon the United States for economic recovery or development. There was no third world bloc which years later pursued a UN policy much more independent of the US, and only 4 countries of the Soviet bloc were members at the time, none on the Security Council. Neither could UN Secretary General Lai of Norway be regarded as neutral in the midst of Cold War controversy. In his memoirs, he makes it remarkably clear that he was no objective outsider. His chapters on the Korean War are pure knee-reflex anti-communism and reveal his maneuvering on the issue. In 1949, it was later disclosed, Lai had entered into a secret agreement with the U.S. State Department to dismiss from UN employment individuals whom Washington regarded as having questionable political leanings. The adoption of these resolutions by the Security Council was possible only because the Soviet Union was absent from the proceedings due to its boycott of the United Nations over the refusal to seat Communist China in place of Taiwan. If the Russians had been present, they undoubtedly would have vetoed the resolutions. Their absence has always posed an awkward problem for those who insist that the Russians were behind the North Korean invasion. One of the most common explanations offered is that the Russians, as the CIA memorandum stated, wanted to, quote, challenge the U.S. specifically and test the firmness of U.S. resistance to communist expansion, unquote. Inasmuch as, during the existence of the Soviet Union, the same analysis was put forth by American political pundits for virtually every encounter between the U.S. and leftists anywhere in the world, before and after Korea, it would appear that the test was going on for an inordinately long period, and one can only wonder why the Soviets never came to a conclusion. The finishing touch, wrote I.F. Stone, quote, was to make the UN forces subject to MacArthur without making MacArthur subject to the United Nations. This came on July 7th in a resolution introduced jointly by Britain and France. This is commonly supposed to have established the United Nations command. Actually, it did nothing of the sort, unquote. The resolution recommended that all members providing military forces and other assistance make such forces and other assistance available to a unified command under the United States. It further requested, quote, the United States to designate the commander of such forces, unquote. This would be the redoubtable MacArthur. It was to be an American show. The U.S. spent the first year of its occupation suppressing the locally formed People's Committees. John R. Hodge, the military governor of South Korea under the United States Army military government in Korea, recruited Koreans who had served in the Japanese Imperial Army to staff an English language officer school. By 1948, a South Korean army was in place, comprising 6 divisions led to man by officers who served in the Japanese Imperial Army. One of the officers, Kim Sok-won, had been decorated by Hirohito for leading campaigns against Korean guerrillas in Manchuria. Hodge also put together a police force, 85% of whose personnel were former members of the colonial police, and set them to work in smashing the government of the locally formed Korean People's Republic. After Mussolini was toppled in Italy, the Americans installed a collaborator who carried on many of Mussolini's policies. The Italians called the new American-installed regime fascism without Mussolini. Likewise, in the south of the Korean peninsula, the Americans had ushered in Japanese colonialism without the Japanese. Military personnel of some 16 other countries took part in one way or another, but, with the exception of the South Koreans, there could be little doubt as to their true status or function. Eisenhower later wrote in his memoirs that when he was considering U.S. military intervention in Vietnam in 1954, also as part of a coalition, he recognized that the burden of the operation would fall on the United States, but, quote, the token forces supplied by these other nations, as in Korea, would lend real moral standing to a venture that otherwise could be made to appear as a brutal example of imperialism, unquote. Public resentment against the U.S. regime was manifested in the form of frequent rebellions, including some guerrilla warfare in the hills, from 1946 to the beginning of the war, and even during the war. The rebellions were dismissed by the government as communist-inspired and repressed accordingly, but as John Gunther observed, it can be safely said that in the eyes of Hodge and Rhee, particularly at the beginning, almost any Korean not an extreme rightist was a communist and potential traitor. General Hodge evidently permitted U.S. troops to take part in the repression. Mark Gain, a correspondent in Korea for the Chicago Sun, wrote that American soldiers, quote, fired on crowds, conducted mass arrests, combed the hills for suspects, and organized posses of Korean rightists, constabulary, and police for mass raids, unquote. Gain related that one of Hodge's political advisors assured him, Gain, that Rhee was not a fascist. He is 2 centuries before fascism, a pure bourbon. Even during the height of the war, in February 1951, reported Professor John Kee Chang-oh of Marquette University, there was the Koshang incident, again involving suspicion of aiding guerrillas, in which about 600 men and women, young and old, were herded into a narrow valley and mowed down with machine guns by a South Korean army unit. There was, for example, the consensus that the brutality of the war in Korea must be laid overwhelmingly on the doorstep of the North Koreans. The Koshang incident mentioned above may be relevant to providing some counterbalance to this belief. Referring to the incident, the British Korea scholar John Halliday observed, this account not only serves to indicate the level of political violence employed by the UN side, but also confers inherent plausibility on North Korea and Southern opposition accusations of atrocities and mass executions by the UN forces and Rhee officials during the occupation of the DPRK in late 1950. After all, if civilians can be mowed down in the South on suspicion of aiding, not even being, guerrillas, what about the North, where millions could reasonably assume to be communists or political militants? Oh's account is but one of a number of reports of slaughter carried out by the South Koreans against their own people during the war. The New York Times reported a, quote, wave of South Korean government executions in Seoul, unquote, in December 1950. Reen Cutforth, a correspondent for the BBC in Korea, later wrote of the shooting without trial of civilians designated by the police as communist. These executions were done, usually at dawn, on any patch of waste ground where you could dig a trench and line up a row of prisoners in front of it. And Gregory Henderson, a U.S. diplomat who served 7 years in Korea in the 1940s and 50s, has stated that probably over 100,000 were killed without any trial whatsoever by Rhee's forces in the South during the war. Following some of the massacres of civilians in the South, the Rhee government turned around and attributed them to the Northern troops. Another widely held belief in the U.S. during the war was that American prisoners in North Korean camps were dying off like flies because of communist neglect and cruelty. The flames of this very emotional issue were fanned by the tendency of U.S. officials to exaggerate the numbers involved. During November 1951, for example, long before the end of the war, American military announcements put the count of POW deaths at between 5,000 and 8,000. However, an extensive study completed by the U.S. Army 2 years after the war revealed that the POW death toll for the entire war was 2,730. The study concluded that, quote, There was evidence that the high death rate was not due primarily to communist maltreatment. It could be accounted for largely by the ignorance or the callousness of the prisoners themselves." Unquote. Callousness refers here to the soldiers' lack of morale and collective spirit. Although not mentioned in the study, the North Koreans, on several occasions, claimed that many American POWs also died in the camps as a result of the heavy U.S. bombing. The American public was also convinced, and probably still is, that the North Koreans and Chinese had brainwashed U.S. soldiers. This story arose to explain the fact that as many as 30% of American POWs had collaborated with the enemy in one way or another, and quote, 1 man in every 7, or more than 13%, was guilty of serious collaboration, writing disloyal tracts, or agreeing to spy or organize for the communists after the war, unquote. Another reason the brainwashing theme was promoted by Washington was to increase the likelihood that statements made by returning prisoners which questioned the official version of the war would be discounted. Brainwashing, said the Army study, has become a catchphrase used for so many things that it no longer has any precise meaning, and a precise meaning is necessary in this case. The prisoners, as far as Army psychiatrists have been able to discover, were not subjected to anything that could properly be called brainwashing. Indeed, the communist treatment of prisoners, while it came nowhere near fulfilling the requirements of the Geneva Convention, rarely involved outright cruelty, being instead a highly novel blend of leniency and pressure. The communists rarely used physical torture, and the Army has not found a single verifiable case in which they used it for the specific purpose of forcing a man to collaborate or to accept their convictions. During its police action in Korea, U.S. dropped more bombs than all the bombs dropped in Europe during World War II, on both sides, and U.S. warplanes dropped more napalm on Koreans than they did later on Vietnamese. Fighting eventually bogged down around the 30th parallel, and a ceasefire was agreed to, but not before the U.S. raised irrigation dams that provided water to 75% of the North's agricultural production, a blatant war crime. At best, there were U.S.-provoked clashes between the revolutionary government of the North and the essentially U.S.-backed colony of the South for years, and finally a full-blown war broke out between the two after the North attacked. At worst, these clashes happened for years, and it was actually the South that invaded the North that day, provoking a U.S.-backed war, which we've been lied to about for decades. Either way, it is not a good look for the traditional history which we have been told. Once upon a time, the United States fought a great civil war in which the North attempted to reunite the divided country through military force. Did Korea or China or any other foreign power send in an army to slaughter Americans, charging Lincoln with aggression? This video is based on the amazing work of William Blum as well as Stephen Goins, sources of which will be linked in the description. Thank you so much for watching. Please consider leaving a tip on PayPal or supporting me on Patreon if you want to help me pay my bills and eat, and you'd love to see more content like this. Be sure to follow on Twitter and have a better day. Thank you.